Well, welcome everybody. I'm glad you're here. And hopefully, if you're not attending in person, you'll have the opportunity to just think about some of the topics that we're going to be discussing in the next 25 minutes or so. Our topic in front of us is looking at the different techniques that are available in the neuraxial space for labor analgesia and the decision points that we have in terms of incorporating these into our practice. I have no disclosures to make except to say that of nonfiction, this is probably one of my favorite quotes. The reason why I like this is it's harnessed with a sense of optimism, and it's the same sort of optimism that we should bring to our work in transforming the parturian and her birth process. And I say this is a journey, and the journey will involve our ideas about Darwin and the idea or principle of natural selection. And this idea was formulated on a group of islands located 600 miles off the coast of Ecuador, still flies under the flag of Ecuador, and that's Galapagos Islands. And it's here that Darwin spent a period of 3 weeks, and through his discoveries, through his intuition, he was able to give us some lessons that we can use today. Now, this was the boat that Darwin voyaged on. This is the HMS Beagle. The third rear mast was added to add to the navigability of the ship for the voyage that Darwin was on. And similarly, we're going to be talking about 3 different techniques. First, the standard epidural, the one that you know so well, works well. The combined spinal epidural, which came into the labor and delivery in 1985, and we've contributed to a lot of the work that is around this process. And in 2006, we conceived the idea, named it the dural puncture epidural. And we've done a lot of both basic as well as clinical work with this technique. And I'd like to share some of that information with you as we think about the techniques. So against the backdrop of the Galapagos Islands, we ponder the techniques that we have available to us. And as we do that, we have to think of what our goals are. The ideal technique for labor analgesia is something that is quick on onset, has very predictable spread, has quality that is adjustable in terms of the depth and duration, and also can alter itself from analgesia to anesthesia if necessary. Finally, one of the major things that we want is a limitation on motor block. I was part of the committee that wrote the ASA guidelines for obstetric anesthesia. And one of our principal tenets that we added was that motor block was not something that we were trying to achieve. So we want essentially a sensory blockade that has minimal maternal and fetal side effects. Now, when we think about the different techniques, we have at our disposal the epidural technique, which is our oldest continuous method, aside from a continuous spinal technique. But with the epidural technique, we come in with an epidural needle, we thread in a catheter, and currently what we use is a high volume, low concentration solution. And it's through this way that we capture any of the nerves that are progressing or egressing from the spinal column. The combined spinal epidural technique added a feature, and that feature that it added was a longer spinal needle. And you introduce the spinal needle into the dural sac. You deposit some medication into this sac, either an opioid, a local anesthetic, or a combination. And we've done a lot of work finding the dose and the appropriate dose for a combination of local anesthetics and opioids. Then you thread in the epidural catheter, and then you just hook it up to your infusion pump. Most do not use a test dose through the epidural catheter, just to hook it up to your infusion pump, and that typically just gives you the nice sort of transgression or transformation from the spinal element to the epidural element. It was in doing a lot of studies with the combined spinal epidural technique that I started thinking about the hole that communicates between the epidural and the spinal sac. And I started thinking about ways in which perhaps that hole was beneficial to the whole process of labor and delivery, and perhaps even the initial and maintenance phases of analgesia. And so we conceived in 2006 a technique that we called the dural puncture epidural technique. I wanted it to be catchy. I remember being on call and being in the call room trying to figure out what I was going to call this technique, but finally I just thought it was the things that we do through this technique. We do that dural puncture, And we come in with the epidural needle, make that puncture into the dural sac. And then without dosing anything, we remove that needle, place that epidural catheter, and then we dose the epidural catheter just like we would a conventional epidural technique. And what we believed is that this would allow translocation of any of that medication that we place in the epidural space into the spinal sac, and that would have some salient effects in terms of labor analgesia. And that was at least our cognition about the technique, and in fact, that is what has been demonstrated with the technique. And I'll say that most of the studies that are done have been done under our influence. John Thomas was one of our fellows, residents and fellows. He graduated before he could commence the study, so he went down to Wake Forest where they used 27 gauge needles. And interestingly, they found no effect of this technique. Now, I will say they were using heavy concentrations of lidocaine, 2% lido, 10 milliliters, which probably set both the epidural and the dural puncture epidural up quite quickly. And as a result, maybe that erased the effect of the dural puncture itself. But all the subsequent studies, especially the ones that were done with 25 and 26 gauge needles, have demonstrated a difference, and an aggressive difference, such that we have faster onset, greater sacral spread, better bilateral coverage. And also, if you follow a DPE with a programmed intermittent epidural bolus, Song nicely demonstrated that that's better than the epidural followed by PIB. And a DPE followed by PIB is better than a DPE followed by continuous epidural infusion. So there's a continuous advantage of that dural puncture that you've created between the epidural and the spinal space. As importantly, we found no differences in hypotension, no differences in high sensory blockade or post-dural puncture headache. And we've confirmed the mechanism of this by doing some pig studies. And we've done both fluoroscopy as well as dye dilution studies. And just to carry you through some of the dye studies that we're currently organizing into a manuscript right now, I anticipate that will be published towards the end of the summer. If you put epidural medications through a catheter in the epidural space, the dye, you wash off the dye, you translocate and dissect down to the spinal column, you will not find any dye there. The dural puncture epidural, we placed epidural dye through the catheter into the epidural space, we washed it off, and then we dissected down into the spinal column, and we found that slight bluish tinge to the spinal column itself and the spinal nerves that come out of the spinal column. The combined spinal epidural, no surprise, if you directly give dye into the spinal space, you'll get a lot of blue that's transmitted onto the spinal tissues themselves. And finally, a wet tap. What was interesting here, it's a larger bore dural puncture epidural, if you will, 17 gauge needle. We demonstrated that if you dose the epidural catheter, you wash out that dye, you'll find that you have more blushing of that blue onto the spinal tissues, more than the dural puncture epidural, which is only using a 25 gauge needle. So this is mechanistically what is going on and our confirmation of that mechanism. Now, I'll say that in order to decide whether or not you want to use a technique, you have to think about the advantages and disadvantages. And in thinking about this very carefully, we can compare the combined spinal epidural with the DPE with the epidural side by side. One of the advantages of a CSE and DPE is that you have confirmation of your location. What do I mean by this? Well, we know that the spinal needle that we're using is longer than the epidural needle. In fact, we want it to stick out about 0.5 to 1 centimeter. And we have this combination with smaller as well as larger needles and differences. And you can go slightly larger, maybe to a 1.5 centimeter difference, but you really should have it less than 1.5 centimeters and closer to 1 centimeter if possible. Because what you're trying to achieve is that if you have an epidural needle into a space that you have a loss of resistance, you want to be able to pass that spinal needle. And if you don't get the spinal fluid, then you know that you most likely advance with your epidural needle, that you just had a false loss of resistance, to the point where eventually you can get to a place where when you pass that spinal needle, You go into the spinal space, you get fluid back out of it. And there, in fact, both achieves the confirmation of where your spinal needle is, but as importantly, most likely your epidural needle will be in the epidural space. In fact, what is interesting, John Thomas's study did tell us some information in that if they're trying to do a DPE technique and they did not get CSF, but they went ahead and said, gosh, this looks very convincing, we'll just go ahead and thread the catheter, see what happens. They had a 22% failure rate of those epidural catheters. By consequence, or by contrast, you look at a dural puncture where you got the CSF, they had less than half the failure rate. And our studies have indicated you have even lower amounts of failure rates of those catheters when associated with the dural puncture epidural technique. Another advantage that we see is onset. We recognized fully and throughout that combined spinal epidural is going to be faster than an epidural. But we wanted to see how the DPE technique set up and whether or not this was something that was intermediate or was it closer to a CSE, closer to an epidural. And looking at this head-to-head, we found that a CSE, and these were all done with just bupivacaine, including the dural puncture epidural and the epidural. We did not use a lidocaine test dose because we really just wanted to understand what was happening with bupivacaine. And we found was dural puncture epidural set up in 11 minutes. This was significantly different than the CSE. And the epidural technique set up in 18 minutes. And again, this was significantly different than the two other techniques. So a DPE gives you an intermediate onset in between the two. One salient advantage of a CSE or DPE is that you have sacral spread. And we acknowledge that sacral fibers are harder to block. The nerve roots themselves, they're larger in diameter. If you do isolated nerve prep studies, and I have in the lab, we know that they're larger, they're covered with more myelin, and as such, local anesthetics have a higher and more difficult job to do in penetrating through the cortex of that nerve in order to achieve local anesthetic blockade. Moreover, when you dose an epidural catheter, most of your injectate, 2/3 of your injectate is actually going to go cephalad. Only 1/3 is going to go caudad. This is because of increased sacral resistance, and as such, epidural dosing oftentimes does not get the epidural medications into the sacral areas. We looked at this and compared the CSE with the epidural, and at 10, 20, and 30 minutes, looking at S2 dermatome, you can see that the CSE sets up better than a traditional epidural. Moreover, when we looked at the dural puncture epidural, same story, and very, very similar to a CSE in that within 10 minutes, we had most people comfortable. It's significantly different than the epidural technique, and this persisted at 20 as well as 30 minutes. And the DPE and CSE became indistinguishable at the 20 and 30 minute mark. We also know that oftentimes parturients get a one-sided block. That's not something that they're looking for. It's not something that we're trying to achieve. And we want bilaterality. We acknowledge that this is a potential space that we're working on. We're spreading apart two different ligaments. We're filling that up with local anesthetics. And some of that local anesthetics and even catheters can efflux out in various pathways, including down through the nerve rootlets. And then looking at this a little bit more closely, we therefore looked at the bilaterality of the spread at 10, 20, and 30 minutes. And again, the DPE and the CSE are better than a traditional epidural technique in all these time points. One advantage of a DPE versus a CSE is that you're actually testing the catheter from the get-go. So you're putting all your medications through the epidural catheter. You get to see its effects at initiation and then decide whether or not it's giving you what you want. Whereas a CSE, you give that a little bit of spinal dose, you really don't know what's happening with that catheter. And even though we compare a CSE with an epidural and we have lower rates of catheter failure, you still have rates of catheter failure with a combined spinal epidural. And in many times, that could have been identified at the get-go had you had that possibility. And that's what the dural puncture epidural offers. An interesting thing to look about also is progress of labor. We're thinking that the DP and CSE will have many salient advantages when compared to the epidural. And this sort of thought process was established at the Dublin Maternity Hospital by Collis and colleagues, where they demonstrated that a CSE versus epidural boluses of 0.25% bupivacaine, and acknowledging that that's a strong concentrated amount, had lower rates of instrumental delivery. No changes in cesarean delivery, but certainly lower instrumental delivery, acknowledging that perhaps the technique matters. So we did the first randomized controlled trial of combined spinal epidural versus epidural, no leprous patients less than 3 centimeters dilated, and found in the CSE group that they actually delivered 30 minutes faster. Cynthia Wong took our information, compared the CSE to parenteral opioids, and found that the CSE group delivered 80 minutes faster. So there's something interesting about the combined spinal epidural technique, maybe the onset of analgesia that's very precise and good that causes this change. And I will talk about that when we talk about disadvantages. When we think about disadvantages, sometimes it's very small elements that can cause either something to be adopted or rejected. And Darwin would say the very same things. Small elements can make positive or negative influences, and we have to take a look at each of those as robustly and perhaps more robustly than we would at the advantages. When we think about the technique disadvantages of a CSE, many of us who have done this process know that fetal bradycardias occur. If you look at this nice meta-analysis by Martysov, it indicates that CSEs have a higher instance of bradycardia when compared to a traditional epidural technique. Marcus van der Velde from Belgium, Wendy Fun from Singapore looked at this a little bit more closely and found that this was most tied to the amount of opioid that you use in your CSE dosing. And if you limit the amount of opioids that you give, then you'll get less bradycardia. Even in our groups where we're using just 17 mics of fentanyl with 1.7 milligrams of bupivacaine for our CSE dose, we still found that we had the most number of decelerations in the CSE group and the most transfer of normal tracings to tracings that we want to pay a little bit more attention to, significantly more. Part of this bradycardia occurs, we think, because of uterine hypertonus or changes in the uterine tone. And if you look at this pictogram of some of our experiences with one particular study looking at this, we were watching the uterine tone 1 hour before the technique, 1 hour after the technique, and determined the difference between the CSE, DP, and epidural. And even though we had less of it to start in the CSE group, we had significantly more after the technique was placed. Now, why does this occur? Well, we think it occurs because of the rapid onset of pain relief. More specifically, stress catechols, you have two of them. Epinephrine actually relaxes the uterus. Norepinephrine contracts the uterus. And what we think happens is the epinephrine falls away very rapidly, leaving that catechol that just contracts the uterus. And sometimes that contraction can be so pronounced that we have to use tocolysis. And there were cases where we had to use terbutaline, 5% of the cases in the CSE group in this particular study. Another disadvantage of various techniques is the amount of work that's required to manage those catheters. And interestingly, what we found was a CSE had a 50% callback rate. And generally, this callback was relatively early on. And it's generally because when people transfer from the spinal portion to now the epidural analgesia, they acknowledge that something's different. They say, something has changed about my analgesia. I'm not as comfortable as I used to be. My feet used to be tingly, and now they're not. My bum used to be a little bit warm, and now it's not. And I'm having discomfort. So we'd have to top them up. The epidural group had a later time course in terms of when they asked us to come back and give them a top off. And that was generally because of patchiness or maybe one-sidedness to the catheter. So the DP technique had the least number of callbacks by a significant margin. When we think about adverse effects, we think about nausea, pruritus, and hypotension. Interestingly, with the epidural technique, we have more nausea. We know that nausea is correlated to pain. So individuals that have more pain definitely need and have more nausea. And this was indicated most likely because people had patchy or one-sided blocks. Pruritus and hypertension, again, tend to be with the opioid and local anesthetic components of the CSE, and that's why he had those more frequently in that population. In terms of high spinal motor blockade, we actually had most of this in the epidural group, and in part that's because we probably had to do some top-offs, make people comfortable, and because we used 0.25% bupivacaine for our top-off, that caused more motor blockade. But interestingly, in all our studies, and we're just now completing a large study looking at all of our replacements, we find that we have not increased our post-dural puncture headache rate. Even though we're using a small needle, that small needle has a less than 1% chance of a headache. Interestingly, we've had actually taking all comers, looking at all of our epidural placements, have a slightly higher post-dural puncture rate, headache rate with our epidural techniques, because once you come in with that 17 gauge needle, create a wet tap, and that's the advantage of the DP and CSE. You can actually check to see where you are. But that epidural causes an 80% chance of headache if you have a wet tap. So how do we put this together in a way that is clinically meaningful, something that we can actually utilize on our labor and delivery floors? And that's where Darwin's words and thought processes really come to play. Darwin did not invent evolution. Darwin was famous for creating this idea of natural selection, that over the course of time, we have things that are advantageous and disadvantages that really ensure or prevent the survival of a species. The finches of the Galapagos all came from the same lineage. There are 13 major islands. There's also 13 subspecies of finches, each a dominant feature on each island. And you can see, just even though we may not be ornithologists, the upper register, those are tree-dwelling finches. Those are ones that have heavy vegetation. The lower portion of this figure, those are ground-dwelling finches, and their dark coloration protect them from predators from above. But the key difference is the size and shape of their beak. And if you want to read a really great book, there's a book called The Beak of the Finch, and that talks about Darwin's early discoveries, fast forwards it to the 60 years that Peter and Rosemary Grant have spent on the island as part of Princeton's universities, look at the islands and updates it with all the knowledge that has been created over that time. Similarly, we've been looking at the epidural technique and the spinal techniques for a long time. In terms of the neuraxiom, spinal is the oldest, 1880s. Epidurals were probably done at the same time because they were utilized in a manner in which they sometimes had to give those spinals an increased dose in order to make them effective, and most likely they were in the epidural space. But the epidural space did come to the labor and delivery wards about 50 years later. This was followed in 1985, as I mentioned, the combined spinal epidural technique, and finally 20 years later we introduced the dural puncture epidural technique. When we think of all the advantages of the techniques relative to each other, we see that the dural puncture epidural has the most advantages in comparison. We also think about the disadvantages, and when we think about these disadvantages, again, the dural puncture epidural has the least number of disadvantages. So the summary that we have is that the dural puncture epidural, when you balance everything, is the technique that provides optimal labor analgesia, and is something that we should all look at a little bit more carefully. We certainly continue to do so, and we have some papers that will be coming out very shortly. New meta-analysis. There's two actually meta-analyses that will be published very shortly. I was external reviewer on those that again confirm the advantages of the dural puncture epidural technique. And I look forward to any questions that you might have. Thank you so much for your attention. I look forward to interacting with you and look forward to seeing you again at some other venue. Thank you very much.